Well, hello. Today's topic is the excerpt from Dale Jamieson's book, Reason in a Dark Time. This is the third of the issues. We're going to take a look at what it looks like to put together all of our various philosophical perspectives into sort of one more unified look at a very important issue in our day. Now, the title, Reason in a Dark Time, is the title of a book that Jamieson wrote and is one of the coolest titles for any book ever. So good on Dr. Jamieson. In fact, this here is your author. This is Dale Jamieson. He is a professor of environmental studies and philosophy at NYU, looking in this picture pretty much as he looked the last time the last and only time that I met him. He'd come to Washburn University where I was working briefly and doing a talk, I think shortly after the publication of Reason in a Dark Time. So in any case, there he is, and we'll get to his account. Okay, and so just like the previous two accounts, this one also begins with a kind of received view, right? A kind of view that's that everyone tends to have in common and that is problematic, right? And the received view of global climate politics is this, that global climate change is a kind of traditional global justice issue, okay? And here's what we mean by that. We mean that it's sort of the kind of issue that's best addressed by agreements between nations. And if you look at the way that most of the press has been on this one, the way that most people think about and talk about doing something about climate change, they talk tentatively like about global summits. And this goes back a long ways. And if you read Reason in a Dark Time, Jamieson, goes through an entire alphabet soup of different, organizations and treaties and conventions, etc., going all the way back even before, I guess the first one in my memory is were the Kyoto Protocols, right? And that happened really kind of a long time ago now that I think about it. I was not very old at that time, and now I'm much older. So in any case, I remember that one most lightly. The Paris Accords, right, are that made a lot of news a couple 3 years back, and etc. I mean, so these are this is one of the things that people focus an awful lot of their attention on, and are viewed to be sort of really important parts of the story here. And I'm not going to say they're not important, and I don't think Jamieson is either. But I think part of Jamieson's point is that we have to start to really look at climate change somewhat differently. And not see it so much as this sort of macroscopic global justice issue, and put it under a slightly different lens, right? And so the reason that we often talk about climate change being a justice issue is because, again, there's a kernel of truth in there. It's a justice issue because in large part what's going on is that rich nations, okay, tend to be the ones doing all the emitting of greenhouse gases, while poor nations are largely the places that are going to be suffering the worst from the effects of such climate change. So that's certainly not fair, right? Those who are getting one kind of a benefit aren't also suffering the same kinds of consequences, and that's unfair. That's why it's a justice issue. Again, there's a kernel of truth in there, but again, Jamieson's going to suggest a slightly different lens to put this under that he thinks is going to make more sense. And so, just to illustrate the different kind of issue that climate change really does represent, he wants to compare it, right, in this particular reading, he wants to compare it to another kind of very traditional international justice issue, okay? And that is something like war. So let's consider the difference between something like a war between states and what climate change is, because again, there's some really important differences between the two. So for example, in a war, right, a war is perpetrated by one government against another. Okay, that's that's how that works. Whereas climate change is not perpetrated by any government policy. No governments are saying, yes, we must change the climate, right? We must, and we gotta change it good. Not the case, right? This is it's not a matter of global policy, and certainly no countries are saying we must change the climate so that our poorer neighbors will be damaged by it or something. That's not a thing. Instead, right, climate change tends to be perpetrated, right, by the global rich, wherever they live, okay, and against the global poor, wherever they live. It's not a matter of government policy that this is happening. War involves the intentional, that is, the knowing and willing infliction of damage, okay? I mean, that's like, into some sense, the damage is the point of the warfare, right? Whereas, of course, many people at least, claim not to even know of any damages resulting from greenhouse gas emissions. That's that GHG, it's greenhouse gas, common phrase there used. Um, well, there you go. uh, as I mentioned, like the damage is part of the point of the warfare, right? So ask any like sort of room full of generals or something like this. Okay, hey, we invented this brand new bomb. It drops for an airplane just like any other bomb, right? It explodes just like any other bomb. It's just that this one does no damage to anyone or anything, right? Do you expect those generals to pay for such a device? No, that would be against the point. The point of of the warfare, right, is that like the damage is done purposefully, right, for a reason to try and get somebody to do what you want or to stop doing what you don't want or something like that, right? Um, yeah. So the damage is sort of the point. But now imagine you say, okay, we're going to give you everyone a new kind of a car. It works the same. It drives the same as your old car. It even makes that fun noise that you like. It's just that it doesn't emit any greenhouse gas emissions, or it does, or it emits those things, but its emissions do no damage at all to anybody for any reason. You'd say, okay, you'd be happy actually. I think everyone would be very happy for their emissions to do no harm. Finally. A war is, of course, limited to the geography of the warring parties, right? If Luxembourg went to war with Italy or something like that, right? Well, then the damage would be limited to Luxembourg and Italy, right? In general, right? I mean, there's some, of course, refugees and some spillover, and war is bad. It can cause all sorts of things like that. But in general, right, a warfare is sort of limited to the geography of the warring parties. But of course, climate change is no such thing. It has no geographic limits, in fact, there's a if you're old enough to remember back when you used to walk into a restaurant and the first thing they would always do is say smoking or non, right? As if that made any sense, right? Because the idea is like, oh yeah, no, I want the non-smoking section, right? I actually heard some wag say that having a non-smoking section in a restaurant is like having a no peeing section in a pool, right? It's that's the way climate change is, right? It's like we're all on the same planet. We don't have like, oh, I'm in a non-climate change section, thank you, right? It doesn't work that way. It's everywhere, right? It's gonna there's no limitation at all. It doesn't. It's just not that way. So when Jamieson talks about the global rich wherever they live and the global poor wherever they live, here's what he means. Again, he thinks that looking at this in terms of national boundaries, in terms of rich countries and poor countries, it's true to a point, right? But it's not the most true way of looking at things, right? It's not the most useful lens to put this under. And so since our focus is on greenhouse gas emissions, automobile ownership is pretty relevant here. And so for better or worse, like, let's just say if you're one of those, if you own an automobile, you are part of the global rich, right? If you do not own an automobile, you're, for the purposes of this illustration, part of the global poor. Now, of course, that's a very overly simplistic way of looking at things for a lot of purposes, but for climate change, it's not that overly simplified, right? Those who own cars are also likely to do plenty of other things that also involve a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. They use more electricity, more gas, more heating, all sorts of other things. And so again, it's actually a pretty sensible dividing line if we're going to have a dividing line. And so here's a list of the top 5 countries, right, that have the most automobiles in them, right, have the highest degree of automobile ownership. And actually, it might be useful for you to think, okay, could I predict that? Let's see, you'll probably predict several of these anyway. Okay, so certainly United States, right? Top of the list, 119 automobiles, and of course, something like 400 million people. Now, of course, a lot of those people are, children. A lot of people, sort of share a vehicle. You have a vehicle for a household, or say 2 vehicles for a household with 5, or something like that. I mean, so it's not the case that every single person in the United States has a car or something like that, but a really sizable percentage, and very similar percentages you see in something like Japan and Germany and Italy. And actually, with those top 4, United States, Japan, Germany, and Italy, you've got 4 out of really the top 5, places that manufacture automobiles. South Korea just being one of those that's not quite in there. Of course, they're a fairly small country in terms of population, and so that's why they don't quite crack this list. But look at the difference between something like the United States or Japan, right, at, say 119 out of, almost 400 million people, 119 million cars, 400 million people. Japan probably has around 110, 120 million people. They have 58 million cars, okay? Germany's probably got about 80 million people or so. They have like 42 million cars, etc., right? I mean, like these percentages are sort of stacking out. Then all of a sudden, China with 1.4 billion people, okay, Now only 35 million cars. So notice again some of the difference here. Like, is China a rich country? Well, I mean, in terms of per capita GDP, total size of the economy, yes, right. But how many of China's citizens would be counted among the global rich? Well, again, for our purposes, 35 million, right, which is not a really sizable percentage of the country. But 35 million cars is still 35 million cars. That still puts them in the top five. And so I think you'll start to see from this illustration how much more sensible Jamieson's way of looking at this is than other kinds of ways of looking at this. Right. So here's the rest of the list. And notice this is not a list of every country in the world and how many cars are in it. This is a nice sampling. Okay. So again, you get, a standard large industrial country like in Russia, France, UK, Brazil, a very solidly sort of upper middle income country, right? 26 million cars there. But then of course you go to India, which has like 1.3 billion people. And you get 13 million cars, right? It's like one out of, what is that, one out of 100? I mean, that's a very interesting split, right? And again, 13 million cars is still a lot of cars, right? That's many, many times more than say Vietnam, for example, which is another fairly solidly middle income country these days. And even many more times more than say Vanuatu or the Central African Republic, which measures the number of cars in that country in the thousands. But yeah, that's the idea, is that again, you've got all of, sort of the global rich spread everywhere, right? If you want to say, oh yeah, Ecuador is a poor country or something, like that, well, look, it's still 300,000 cars there, right? And so there's at least some, right, of the global rich there, perhaps not as many as in, say, the United Kingdom, but, still lots. And so that's, again, where it makes more sense to talk about the global rich wherever they live and the global poor wherever they live, okay? And so to continue with that theme, we want to point a couple of things out. So first off, look, it is true that rich countries as a whole tend to emit more greenhouse gases, while poor nations, again, tend to suffer the effects of climate change. And it's just a lot more true that the richest people in the world, wherever they live, emit more greenhouse gases, while the poor tend to suffer the effects wherever they live. You don't have to live in a poor country to suffer the effects of climate change either. So here's an example of that. All right, so let me get my little laser pointer out. Doop, doop. Okay, so over here, right, we've got this chart here. This shows neighborhood poverty in New Orleans using census data from the year 2000. Okay, we have census every 10 years, so there we go. And so this is the Orleans Parish, and so if you take a look at all these different sort of wards, I think that's what they call them in New Orleans, neighborhoods might be another word for it. So these darkest blue areas here have poverty rates greater than 40%. Right, and if you remember from the previous, in general, our poverty rate underestimates the actual level of poverty, but there you go. And so these slightly, the lighter the shade of blue, the less poverty you're talking about. So you're talking about sort of less than 10% poverty rates. So like, say here, this little pocket here, a little tiny bit here actually, and then sort of up here, you see, a lot less poverty, right? Now, of course. You can then go over here, and this is a percent change in population by neighborhood. This is population change from between the 2000 census, which is the same year in which this data was taken, and the 2010 census, which is the next time it came around. And so this measures the total change by percentage in population of these places. So the idea is that these darkest green areas here represent remarkable decreases. So here, for example, is a decrease of between 50 and 99.6% population. I mean, somewhere in this area had 99.6% population decrease. Okay, that's basically almost everybody, right, in a certain area. And of course, a little bit, sort of less dark greens indicate something like either 35 to 50% or 25 to 35%, or this shade here, 15 to 25%, and then these lighter shades here, 0 to 15. And then of course, there's some of these neighborhoods grew. Okay, and so this is, sort of this light tan color, I guess. That's somewhere between 0 and 10%, so that's here and here, right? And then a 10 to 30% increase here and here, right? So what's going on with this, right? So what does this indicate happened, right? And see, do you see some correlation going on between the colors here? So okay, well, this is pretty obvious, right? There's this big dark color here, lots of poverty, lots of population shrink, right? Lots of poverty here, lots of population shrink. Again, except for some notable little exceptions, right? So this little piece here, this little piece there, this bit there, this bit there, right? But for the most part, you see wherever you've had some of these really darker colors, you've had a lot of population decrease. And you might say, okay, so what happened between 2000 and 2010 in New Orleans, right? Think about that for a second. Of course, Hurricane Katrina, right in the middle, 2005. And one of the things that we know about what happened there is that the poor residents of New Orleans, they suffered disproportionately from dislocation, a lack of rescue efforts, a lack of medical relief, a lack of food relief, and have received very much less and really little to no assistance in terms of rebuilding, coming back. And so should it be any small wonder then that these damaged neighborhoods, in fact, if you go to New Orleans today, you're going to see whole neighborhoods that just have, all kinds of homes that are sort of just boarded up and, heavily damaged. They're not habitable really. Certainly not in their current states, but like people who lived in them couldn't afford to come back and fix them. Didn't have enough insurance, didn't have enough assistance, and just didn't have enough money of their own, right? Whereas people who did have enough money of their own have largely come back, rebuilt, and are doing fine. And so I'm going to address one more issue here. You want to say, okay, right, what does Hurricane Katrina have to do with climate change, right? But again, this is to some extent saying did climate change cause Hurricane Katrina is a little bit like asking whether somebody's batting average caused them to get a hit, right? It's really the other way around. It's that, look, we do know that climate change tends to make, we know that hurricanes, for example, they're fed by warmth, right? Warm air, warm water, all that sort of stuff. They're fed by heat. That's what they do. And so if you have a system with sort of more overall heat, right, then you have storms with more overall energy, right? Were there hurricanes before massive climate change? Yes, right, absolutely. But with climate change, we're going to see more hurricanes. We're going to see them worse on average than they would be without it, because it's just a simple matter of temperature, right? Heat fuels these things. So that's the sense in which we're going to use this, sort of hurricanes and hurricane severity as part of some of the effects that climate change does have. Notice here we're talking about climate change and its effects in the United States, in a very rich country. Okay, and so again, this really highlights what Jamieson is talking about here. He's talking about the global rich, wherever they live, tending to contribute much more to the emissions, to the problem, and the global poor, wherever they live, right, including in rich countries, suffering the bulk of the effects, right, having all the disadvantages. And so again, we see a difference, right, between the poorer in New Orleans and the wealthier in New Orleans, right? So here's another aspect of climate change, right, which is the disruption of climate patterns, the change of climate patterns that will lead to changes in the average amounts of rainfall that various different places have. So this is a map of projected drought vulnerability. Okay, and so again, you see sort of the redder colors, right, the redder end of the rainbow, sort of red, orange, yellow is sort of bad, right? So looking like, oh, it's that's very drought vulnerable. Okay. Versus sort of green or other area where drought's not that big of a deal, or they're not tremendously vulnerable just based on current projections. So again, I want to point out a couple of things. All right, so let's point out, say for example, you look at Australia here. Look, the interior of Australia is pretty arid and not very, it's very sparsely inhabited. Okay, but there's a lot of drought vulnerability in places, that are inhabited. There, people live there, and that's going to be tough, right? It's going to create some real challenges for Australia. And if you're going to look at a place that's really similar, maybe you're going to look kind of over here, right? Perhaps in the region of Pakistan or Afghanistan, somewhere around here. So who's going to be better equipped to deal with climate change, Australia or Afghanistan or Pakistan, right? I mean, right? Obviously, as a country, Australia is going to do better, right? They have more money. They're a richer country by and large. Okay, but again, we can't just treat this as on such a macro scale. We can zoom in a little bit. And you'll have to excuse me, I haven't really, I didn't upgrade the quality of the image to do this, and so the image is a little blurry, but I trust you all know what the United States looks like anyway, at least on a map, and are okay with this. And yeah, it's a little bit blurry, but we can live with it. It'll still teach us what we want to learn. So again, let's zoom in. Okay, so again, the United States is not going to be sort of all in the same boat in terms of drought vulnerability. So say if you look at what's up here, what's right about there. So if you think this is Washington, this is Oregon, this is California, right here's the peninsula, Baja California, part of Mexico, right? And so if California, Oregon, this is Idaho, then here is what? Okay, if you're yelling out Montana, Montana, you idiot. Yes, this is roughly Montana. Okay, versus say here, which is roughly what say California. Okay, look at lots of red, lots of orange. Okay, these are bad. Now, again, who's more likely to be able to handle climate change better over the course of the next couple of decades? Is it going to be Montana or is it going to be California? And if you're saying California, of course, because they have money. Yes, right. I mean, Montana doesn't have a state sales tax, for goodness sakes, right? Their state budget is mere fractions of California's state budget. They just don't have those kinds of resources. It's a very low tax, low service state, and versus California, which tends to be a high tax, high service state. But it's going to be able to do some things with the resources it has that are not available, right, to folks in Montana, and that's going to be the way it is. But of course, even zoom in. Right, zoom in on California. Are there going to be some cities in California, some parts of California that are going to be much better able to deal with whatever's coming than others? Absolutely. And generally, the parts that have more money. Zoom in just on Los Angeles. Are there going to be parts of Los Angeles that are going to be able to deal with heat and drought better, right, over the course of the next several decades or more? Yes, absolutely. Zoom in further. Are there certain parts of certain neighborhoods in Los Angeles that are going to do better than others? And again, yes. Right, so you see that the more localized you make this picture, the more it becomes obvious what's going on. It's not about rich countries and poor countries. It's about the global rich wherever they are and the global poor wherever they are. So one particular example of this is from that Jamieson mentions is the Chicago heat wave of '95. He puts it this way. He says in a fascinating book, Klinenberg, 2002, documents in detail the victims of this event. They were disproportionately low income, elderly, African-American males living in violence-prone parts of the city. A total of 739 people died in the heat wave. More than 4 times as many as in the Oklahoma City bombing that occurred 3 months earlier, although it received much less media attention. This pattern of the poor suffering disproportionately from climate-related impacts, even in rich countries, occurred once again in the wake of Hurricane Katrina, which struck the Gulf Coast of the United States in August of '05. Right. So, I mean, look, heat waves do actually kill people, and especially in drought conditions and things like that. And that's one of those things it's disproportionately socioeconomic in terms of its impact. And so this is, I think, Jamieson's going to be Jamieson's overall point here, is that he wants people to consider all of this stuff in a new way. And again, let's think of what's going on. So we've got certainly this received view, this idea that climate change has to be this international issue. And it looks like when we get a little bit skeptical about that received view, we see that it's not as accurate as looking at it in another way. In fact, it's not as accurate, it seems like, as looking at it on a much smaller scale, at a more individual level, at a more sort of household by household, neighborhood by neighborhood level, as opposed to an international level, right? And so that's certainly where a kind of skeptical worldview, something we spent a lot of our epistemology unit talking about, would make sense for us. Also, when we start to think about what kind of an issue climate change really is, okay, again, we're examining our concepts here. We're trying to put our concepts into the best context for them. That's exactly the kind of thing one does in metaphysics. And if what we're doing here is we're trying to decide what to do, what's good and what's bad to do, well, now we have a value perspective. And I think we've got some real questions in distributive justice that are raised by taking a look at the likely impacts of climate change, in the sense that there's a very serious unfairness going on there, and that we have to, as a society, take a look at how we're dividing up our resources, how we're deciding who gets how much of what. And of course, there's reasonable debates to be had here. Is what's going on? Do we have an unjust procedure for deciding who gets what and how much? Do we have simply just an unjust outcome in terms of who has how much? Is there too much bias of one kind or another in terms of who gets how much? In which case, sort of Rawls's approach would seem the best way to fix that. Is what's going on that we're not doing enough to benefit the least well off for prioritarian reasons? Or is the problem that there's too many people who don't have enough, right? And that we're trying to make a more sufficientarian argument. Again, all of these things are on the table, but certainly they're the kinds of things that Jamieson thinks we should focus on a much smaller scale. And so Jamieson's going to be telling us here that climate change is just as big of an issue within nations as it is between nations. And it's a very disturbing highlight of economic inequality. In general, all disasters are disturbing highlights of economic inequality. I mean, if you look at, say, the current disaster with COVID-19, I think there's some very disturbing highlights of economic inequality. Those who are doing fairly well tend to be among the richer people. Like people who tend to have more money are doing much better than people who have less money. And that's, again, that seems to be true of basically every disaster. But one of the things I think that is very interesting about this is that it again helps to look at this on a smaller scale. If we think of climate change and its effects as much more like an individual moral issue and much less like an international issue, perhaps things actually get a lot better a lot faster. So I think we've all heard stories about people coming together as, as communities, as neighborhoods. People say, oh, look, I know that down the street I have somebody who's, an older person that they're at higher risk for this whole thing. And so I'm going to make sure that I, get in contact with them, and say, hey, if you need somebody to go and pick up some groceries for you, I'm happy to do that. You hear stories of that happening all over the place. And just imagine in the Chicago heat wave of 95, had there been just a few more people who'd said, look, I know that a lot of people are having brownouts here. If they haven't paid their utility bills or haven't been able to, they've, they might be living without air conditioning in these high rises that get extremely hot, especially on the upper floors. And so maybe I should just invite, some neighbor of mine, somebody who lives in the same building, invite them over to my place, to just spend a few, at least the hottest hours of the afternoon. We'll listen to the radio, we'll watch the TV, we'll just talk. Maybe I'll learn something. Maybe I'll make a friend. And so again, these are the kinds of things that when we deal with disaster on a much more individual basis, things tend to go much better. And for the most part, I think people do this, right? And people are really great about it. I think it's sort of the rare exception that doesn't do this sort of thing, that sort of thinks of just themselves first and only. That's all to the good, right? I mean, I think in general, if you look, there's an old Abraham Lincoln claim, is that if you look for the bad in man, expect to find it. But there's plenty of good, and when you look for that, expect to find some of that as well.